or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the country. I'm Harvey Rosenthal. I'm the CEO of NYAPRS, the New York Association of Psychiatric Rehabilitation Services. We are a partnership of people who use and or provide community-based mental health services and supports. And rights, recovery, rehabilitation, community inclusion, criminal justice reform have been really the central part of our missions. This is really today about rights, which is really ground zero for us. Just want to say a couple of quick words. I don't think I've ever seen the push towards coercion here in New York and nationally that I've seen in a very long time. And I think it's really what I'm observing is it has to do with a frightened public who's frightened for all kinds of reasons, you know, the COVID, the war, the horror of the war, economic fears, national divides, the politics, rates of violence. But what happens is when the public's afraid, they sometimes will seize upon some sort of remedy, and the politicians and the media, and in this case, the New York Post, have identified a scapegoat to keep the public, to act like the public will be safer. We know that people in our world are not the ones to be associated with violence, but it's the connection with violence that really drives, at least in New York, this push towards coercion that has increased in the past year. Many of us who tried to fight that battle really led with the idea that there are alternatives. We don't need to go to coercion. If the goal is to engage people who really are in need, are in distress, we have all kinds of ways with rights, with choice, and with dignity. And most of them supported by peers. So this event, which is really an exciting event, is going to give you, you'll hear presentations from our champions, our heroes from New York and around the country. And they'll be going over alternatives to coercion that are offered by peers. So I want to introduce our first speaker, who's Dr. Peter Stastny. Peter Stastny is also a historic sort of figure. He is known in all kinds of circles. In some cases, he founded the International. Oh, Peter, I can't read this here. Can you help me?
Network towards alternatives and rights-based support.
Thank you. Which is called INTAR. He also co-wrote with Darby Penny a very famous book called The Lives They Left Behind, stories of people who had lived at Willard State Psych Center. And he's quite a champion. I know he did a lot of work with me and others this year trying to push back on coercion. So I'll turn it over to Peter.
Hi, everybody. I'm glad you're all here, able to join. I mean, the idea for this came out of the notion that people who are in the street without a home need some connection, and oftentimes the connection would be provided by peers. They don't need to be dragged off in handcuffs by police to a mental institution. They need to be supported. And there's a lot of peer workers in this state and in the country that are actually doing that work, and some of them are with us. And some of the people have their own experience of being without a home. And I'll tell you a brief story just to set the stage for this. Over 35 years ago, I was working at Bronx State Hospital on an open ward. And there was a fellow there. Everybody on that ward was technically homeless. They had nowhere to go. The door was open and no one left, because they had nowhere to go. But a man who came from Jamaica, his name was Lennox Lewis. Some of you might think he's a famous boxer, but I think he was named after the famous boxer. And he said, on the plane over, I saw all kinds of food being thrown out. People didn't touch their meals, and then it was being thrown out. And why don't we collect extra food that's being thrown out here, even on the ward, and bring it out to homeless people? That was his idea. And out of that came a project that started in the mid-'80s and was called Share Your Bounty, Friends of the Homeless, Share Your Bounty. And it was founded by Lennox, William Brown, and a number of other people. And eventually this project got a federal grant, and it became one of the first consumer operated programs that Laura knows very well. And one of those programs was also the Oakland Independent Support Center, which Howie the Harp ran. So that's how we all got from Bronx State to a national scene of peer run. At that time, it was called consumer run programs that were kind of way ahead of their time. And that's when I met Celia and we started the Peer Specialist Project. So the idea that people who are formerly homeless and technically still are homeless can reach out and help people who are still homeless is an old idea and a powerful idea. And I think nowadays, 35 years later, more and more people talking about that as being one of the ways to help people not only off the streets, because people need homes. You know, they don't just need peer support, they need homes and housing. And then on the way there, however, people don't trust the system. And if peers can reach out, maybe they will be able to help them make all the bureaucratic changes that are needed to get a house, because that's one of the hardest things. So I'll be quiet now. I'll introduce Celia. Celia Brown. We met around that time, maybe a couple of years later. And Celia was working on as one of the first peer specialists in New York State, and then became the stellar person that she is now, with so many different organizations involved, secretly still working for the Office of Mental Health, running peer support services and working for, creating an organization called Surviving Grace, which she'll tell us all about, working for with international work and working for I'm Ron's organization. Sorry, I'm blocking the name.
Mind Freedom.
Mind Freedom International. So Celia, take it away. You've been my heroine and friend and partner for so many years. It's been wonderful, and I'm so happy that we're doing this together.
I'm so happy too. You're my hero too, and Harvey, you too. And you know, I stand on the shoulders of so many, like Howie the Harp, Laura Van Tosh, you know, just to name a few. So I'm just honored that I'm here. I feel like the movement has really changed my whole entire life, and peer support has changed me. I don't know where I would be. So in 2014, we were having a lot of police killings. You know, we had Eric Warner in Staten Island and Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. And it just seemed like every other week, police were killing our people, and they were killing Black and Brown, Indigenous people of color. And when things happen like this, I always say, well, what are we going to do? Let's create something. I know a lot of you do that. And so I got some movement leaders together to create, really, we were on a conference call and we said, well, what are you going to do? Well, let's create Surviving Race, because who better to change what's happening in the community than us? We're people with the lived experience. We've been through the system, and who else can do it? So Surviving Race is a intersection of people who are in our movement, psych survivors and advocates, and the LGBTQI community, the BIPOC community, white allies. We've started very, very, very small, and we've grown to maybe 1,000 members on Facebook. And you know, we have conference calls and webinars, and we're having a Surviving Race dialogue in Savannah. And one of the campaigns that in August, we created was stop calling the police, because, you know, everyone calls the police. It's a part of our culture. Something happens, call 911. But, you know, our loved ones have called the police if, you know, if their loved one is having an altered state, having an emotional distress, and we're like, let's call the police. We feel we're doing the right thing. They come to our house and they don't help with the situation. So if that person is in, you know, emotional distress, and maybe they lodge to police, then why is that person, killed, shot? Why is that happening? And so we did a campaign to, call a friend, call a peer, call a warm line, call, some of the mental health hotlines that we don't even utilize sometimes. Why is the first response the police? So I think we were successful. It took us a while to do it because, again, the whole country is into calling 911, and they really shouldn't be the first responders. Not that they shouldn't be involved, but why are they the first responders? So I'm really proud of it. This is something that is very close to my heart. I'm a mom with an African-American son, and I always worry about him when he goes out. I'm like, can you call me? He says, oh, Mom, I'm old, but it's different. Oh, I think Evelyn, is that you? You want to be on mute? Sorry. So I'm going to stop there. The name of Surviving Race, we just say it for short, Surviving Race, but it's the intersection of injustice, disability, and human rights. So I am very excited about our panelists, and our first panelist is a very good friend of mine for years. We've been in the movement for so long, and we're really, really good friends, is Laura Van Tosh. And let me read a little bit about her. I hope I don't embarrass you, Laura, but I want to read some of her bio. Laura Van Tosh is the convener of Washington Legislative and Policy Advocates, a nonpartisan, all-volunteer educational venture focused on health and well-being. Laura has written extensively about peer-run programs and has directed several peer-run services, including the National Mental Health Consumer Self-Help Clearinghouse. Laura lives in the thriving Central District in Seattle and active in local politics. And she's serving as a precinct committee organizer. And she was on the East Coast for a long time. And I remember coming when you had your go away party in Washington, D.C., I believe. And I just thought, okay, I'm not going to see Laura again. Oh my God, But, we're in contact all of the time. So I'm just so grateful for you. And Laura, take it away.
Thank you very much, Celia. And thank you, Peter and Harvey, for bringing together this really important dialogue. I first want to say that I did see Celia in Boston. That was the year of the eclipse. Remember that? So we ended up together. Yeah,
Oh my God. You have
that's
a good
right.
memory.
I can't believe, well, I can only remember you. I love you with all my heart. And I want to say that I first met Celia when she was with Share Your Bounty, which was the program that Peter described. She and Dick Ellman, God rest his soul, were very involved in this important feeding program. And so let me go ahead and sink into my notes a little bit and really get to the beginning of the heart of the matter, which each speaker will be definitely embracing and sharing with you. Currently, yes, I'm with Washington Legislative and Policy Advocates, but I also, as a volunteer, help coordinate the Mental Health Policy Roundtable, which I brought with me from the Washington, D.C. area to bring together veterans of the policy field together with newcomers so that people could exchange their knowledge from 20, 25, 30 years ago in the area of policy and begin to transfer that knowledge to the newcomers who are working in junior level policy positions, such as aides to your legislature, aides to Congress people in Congress, younger people working at the university level, just getting their toes kind of warmed up to work in the area of behavioral healthcare policy. So my love is policy right now, but my roots are really with direct service. And my very first job in the field was director of Project Oats, which is outreach, advocacy, and training services for people who are homeless and mentally disabled. And it was one of the first peer-run programs funded by the National Institute of Mental Health. In those days, it was kind of an accident that it got funded in a batch of other projects that were not peer-run. So off we went with this very modestly funded 3-year, what they call demonstration program. And my job was to lead a team of outreach workers to, quote, demonstrate that peers could do outreach and engagement services and help people come off the streets about the same as non-peers. So we had a little bit of a research project, very kind of narrowly focused, so that we could bring out the skills and abilities that people with who have been formerly homeless could perform on this outreach team. And this was in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, I forgot to mention. And that's when I first met Celia. We worked as a team. I had a team of 10 people who did street outreach from 6 p.m. to 2 a.m. every day, 7 days a week. We also developed some other programs off of Project Oats so that we could engage people regarding employment, learning to live on one's own in the community, and other services so that we could engage people. I want to just say in terms of context, and I forgot to mention that in order for me to have gotten that job, I needed to have been homeless, and I actually was when I was 19. But I have more current homelessness experience in that about 8 or 9 years ago, I was on the streets of Oregon, homeless and without much hope in terms of recovery. And so I have recent experience in the climate that we're in today around the services, some that we have, some that we don't, and around the engagement with peers in terms of outreach and engagement, more current experience than I did when I was 19. So I have a couple things to say about that a little bit later. When I work with Project Oats, and now I'm living in Seattle, just a bit of context, we have 40,000 people at our last count that are homeless on the streets in Seattle and King County. We have a huge population that are living in encampments, places that I know I never saw when I was doing street outreach. Really places that are unfit for human habitat are where people are living now, in environments that would just make your stomach turn. And the numbers of people, we are the third largest homeless population by county in the United States of America right now. And there are a lot of efforts right now to lower that number and develop permanent supportive housing. And don't get me wrong, we're trying to reduce those figures, but we got, the numbers where we're at today because we didn't have appropriate street outreach and appropriate permanent supportive housing. So we're really kind of climbing up the ladder while the river is flowing beneath us. I want to just emphasize some strategies given our subject today in support of helping people with lived experience of homelessness. One is that there's no wrong interaction. Now, I want to just compare that when I worked on Project Oats, we worked as a team and we deployed ourselves in the city in a very earmarked area of downtown to do street outreach. So we weren't all over the city, we were in one particular area. And I think today, we don't really strategize our outreach that way. We were able to actually bring in more people when we were concerted in our geographic approach to doing outreach. And so there was never a wrong interaction. Whenever we approached anyone who was sleeping on a vent, which are those steam vents that you so often see in big cities, we would have a very brief interaction with them. Hello, what can I do for you today? We'd stoop low in terms of our body positioning and get on the ground and say hello to someone and actually try to have a conversation. And even if they didn't want to go anywhere with us, we would come back the following day and restart that dialogue again and say, is there anything that we can do for you? So that if they didn't come up immediately and say, okay, I'm ready for services, we would actually show up and show up and show up. So that repetitive nature was more possible when we really looked at the geographic areas that we were actually physically doing street outreach. We went back to our peer movement roots in so many deep, important ways in terms of treating people with dignity and respect, being able to share our own personal stories with people while they were on the streets, literally on a street corner, share a little vignette or a little positive story that would help people see that there was a way out as well as a way in if someone wanted to come in. And I'll tell you, if someone said, I'm ready to go right now and get myself some food and a place to sleep tonight, up we went. We didn't have long conversations. We got up and we made sure that we delivered. And that's another issue, is that the system so often says, well, I'll be back in a week, you know, and bring you your paperwork. Well, we would do those things instantaneously, because we knew that you could lose people in a moment's notice if you didn't provide the service that they were asking for, especially if they were asking. I wrote a paper in 1993, which I'll make available to the follow-up to this program. It's called Working for a Change, and it talks about peer street outreach for people who are homeless and mentally disabled. And it has the following that I'm going to briefly run down, which I looked at last night. I looked at this paper and I thought, everything in here is so relevant today, but I'm only part of a panel. So one is that, remember what we know about us. For those people that are on the line today in this program, we know so much about who we are. We have street smarts. We know where to go to the food bank. We know where not to go. We know who has the best produce. We know who has the most canned goods. We know which mental health center is the best place to get your needs met or get a COVID shot. We're extremely knowledgeable in terms of information and referral. We have systems knowledge. We don't provide people with the wrong phone number or the wrong address, which so often, unfortunately, can happen. We understand basic human needs. We know what it's like not to have a hot meal. We know what it's like not to have a good place to sleep at night. We get these things and we can talk about them. I know this sounds basic, but I guess I just want to reaffirm our peer values are woven into these particular strategies. We know how to cope without. We can cope with the SSI check that runs out. We can cope with making replacements for services that we otherwise would not be able to get. We're flexible and we're patient. That's really a big one. We're not insistent. We're not people that grow intolerant when someone says no to a particular program or service. We say, okay, let's revisit that tomorrow. Let's come back and see what else we can do for you. I think also one of the disappointments I have over the course of these many years is that Project Oats operated with the team format, like I mentioned, and no outreach worker went alone. We had everyone doubled up and deployed in certain areas, as I said, and we were on teams and we encouraged each other to kind of bounce off each other and speak up. And I think organize is probably my last comment is really around organizing. One of the first things I did as the project director for Project Oats was organize a citywide speak out for homeless people. And we served 3 meals over the course of the day. And you know that we had a line of people standing outside that door when they heard that we had breakfast, lunch, and dinner. And we were there all day and we had panels of city staff and other people that gave presentations of what they have to offer. And then we had a speak out where people who were homeless talked about what their needs were. We drew up a document with everything that everyone said, and we started using that to get organized in our city and start advocating for permanent supportive housing, other peer services. It sounds like a little bit of a miracle, but it kind of was. And I ran across a stack of black and white photos that were taken that day. And it just brought incredible memories of what we can do when we galvanize the pain and suffering and come together and create something that we can move forward with. So I encourage you to get organized. There's no time like the present time. Harvey set the stage that things are really in a difficult place. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to hearing other people's comments as well.
Thank you so much, Laura. Our next speaker is Evelyn Graham Nasi. I'm so proud that she is here. She's an advocate. She's a graduate of City College, Bureau of Manhattan Community College, and she's also a graduate of Howard T. Harp Advocacy Center. I love hearing that. Currently, and she's works as an advocacy specialist for community access. And she's currently now a graduate student at St. John's University School of Education. So Evelyn, take it away. Evelyn, are you there? She might be on mute.
Thank you for allowing me to speak, Sylvia and Harvey and Peter. I was homeless after living in a hotel because my boyfriend would drink, destroy property, and fight with others. That happened in Smyrna, Delaware, and Dover, Delaware. After being thrown out of the last hotel, I found myself in a shelter in Dover, Delaware, with my daughter and an abusive mate. I had to take care of my daughter, balance keeping the peace in my relationship and being homeless. What I did to get through that situation was pray a lot, take advantage of the services that were offered, and I participated in as many activities that were offered in the shelter. I was blessed to find a job while in the shelter. A WIC nutritionist would pick me up from the shelter and take me to work every day. 2 months after being into the shelter, I moved to a new townhouse called Walker Woods, which was Section 8 housing. Because I was still with my boyfriend, things fell apart for me again. After I learned that he was using drugs in addition to drinking excessively. We were evicted from there too. I found the trailer to rent by Delaware State College. We had my daughter and son living with us this time, and we lived there until my first psychiatric hospitalization. When my boyfriend went to jail for stealing items from military families, I found myself all alone with no family to help me and my children. I was homeless once again. My children were sent to New York City. My boyfriend was released, and we lived with my best friend until I moved to Watcoat Houses in Dover, another Section 8 complex. I lived there until I moved to New York City, where I was finally strong enough to get rid of my boyfriend. After a year of taking care of my children and mom, I went back to work. Then I returned to school and I got my AA and bachelor's degree, and I am almost finished with my master's degree in adolescent education. After being hospitalized by force in 2018, I went to Howard Harp Advocacy Center for the Spear Specialist Training Program, which is an intense 20-week program. I had to do 12-week internship, which I did at Community Access in the Advocacy Department with Carla Rabinowitz. After my internship was over, I was hired as an advocacy specialist. My coworker Fiona and I would help Carla prepare for rallies, legislative day, event for CA participants, meetings with New York City elected leaders, and others along with Correct Crisis Intervention Today, NYC, which is a coalition of peers, mental health advocates, and attorneys. CCIT advocates for a non-police response to mental health crisis calls. They propose to use a peer with lived experience and an emergency medical technician to respond to these calls because the police are not properly trained to de-escalate the situation. 19 people were murdered in New York City by police officers who responded to their crisis calls and shot them, even after receiving crisis intervention training. Peers would know how to assist the person by treating them with compassion and respect, unlike the police would treat them, which would be like criminals. CCIT's proposal is based on the Cahoots model in Eugene, Oregon, that has been operating successfully for 30 plus years. The peers and others with experience in mental health profession must do 500 hours of training with 20 hours in the classroom. It should be noted that the staff does not carry any weapons and no one has been murdered or injured. The police may have had to come to calls for 150 times out of 25,000 calls. CCIT NYC was happy when Mayor de Blasio set aside $112 million to create a crisis response model for New York City. CCIT NY even worked with the New York City officials to map out the plan based on the Cahoots model. However, New York City decided to create Be Heard, which has a social worker and 2 MTs responding to mental health crisis calls. Be Heard has no peers on staff, and the police still responds to 80% of the calls because Be Heard only operates about 16 hours a day. CCIT is currently meeting with elected officials to make the case for New York City to adapt NYC's proposal. As a member of the CCIT NYC Steering Committee, I have testified at the New York Civilian Complaint Review Board, New York City Council, at City Council member offices, New York State Legislator rallies, and I have done workshops at NIAPRIS and the New York Working Peers Conference. I was also a panelist on the Health and Housing Consortium panel, and I presented at the New York Society of Ethical Culture. I am also part of the team that created the advocacy course for APS. Next, I'll be conducting a workshop at Queensborough College on June 10th and another workshop at the New York Working Peers Conference in July. Here are some of the strategies I think we can use to assist the homeless without treating them like criminals. Let's start by treating the homeless with the dignity and respect that they are due. Be trauma-informed, realizing that homelessness is a traumatic experience. Then we can work on preventing homelessness. We would need to provide people housing with no strings attached, good health care, job training, and employment, government entitlements, not SNAP, like SNAP, SSI, SSD, Medicaid, and cash benefits. Let's also decrease the amount of time it takes to get these entitlements. Sometimes it's 45 days to get public assistance and 6 months for SSI and SSD. It's too long. Let's provide substance abuse treatment, counseling, and have clubhouses, drop-in centers to promote socialization and the like. We would need peers with lived experiences to help the homeless navigate through the various systems. Let's also work to prevent people who are already in their apartments from being evicted because they are mentally or physically sick. I know that I was almost evicted because I was physically and mentally sick, and no one came to see me and to see if I was alive. I did have the money, but there was no one available to help me pay my bills. I also know a lot of NYCHA tenants who were evicted because of this. We need to have a landlord refer the tenant's case to someone who can come and provide the services and support that tenant's needs. Sort of like the ACT team, assertive community treatment, not send the tenant eviction notices if the tenant hasn't paid their rent. Find out why they didn't pay. I know that I did not have enough energy to pay my bills. Here are some solutions that should help combat homelessness. We can use crisis respites, in-home support services, provide peer-oriented support, have people connected to society, not aside, use mobile crisis teams and stabilization centers so they won't have to be hospitalized, make physical changes in their environments like a bright, cleaning living space, not the dark, dirty shelters that have been destroyed by others. We can meet the homeless where they are. Use person-centered counseling and motivational interviewing to build trust and encourage, not force homeless to do anything. Let them make a change in their time, not ours. We can also educate the homeless about the services that are available to them because most are unaware of the services. Now let's talk about alternatives to coercion.
Evelyn, this is wonderful.
Sorry.
We're gonna have a dialogue where I want you to say everything you said was just, wonderful. But we're going to have a dialogue together, and I want you to bring up these solutions and strategies. Is that okay?
Yes,
Sorry
sorry.
to cut you off. I cherish you so much, and I'm so happy with everything that you're doing in New York City. You're such a great advocate. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Our next speaker is Vesper Moore. I'm so excited that they is here. I'm going to read a little bit about Vesper's bio. Vesper Moore is a MAD liberation activist, trainer, and psychiatric survivor. They have been advocating as a part of the MAD disability rights movement for several years and have been the recipient of many social justice and diversity awards. Vesper, as a MAD queer Indigenous person, has MAD life's mission to rewrite the narrative on mental health, on the mental health industrial complex as it enforced on our society. And please say more. I'm so happy, Vesper, that you are here. You might want to also mention the Bazelon Advocacy Award that you received.
Thank you, Celia. Yeah. I mean, there's so much there, and I think just to clarify for those of you who might be like, oh, the term MAD, or how does that relate in a lot of ways? For me, my experience with mental health as a psychiatric survivor, as someone in many different contexts, we often criminalize people with mental health diagnoses, right? So that criminalization has always been associated with the word MAD. So the word MAD is to take our power back. That is why I very intentionally use it. Some people might use it, some people might not, but that's why. I think that a starting point for me is I am someone who grew up in Massachusetts. I live in Massachusetts currently, the land that's known as Massachusetts. I actually live on Nipmuc land specifically. But my experiences were in Section 8 housing, right? Growing up, as many brown kids would in the city that I lived in, which is Worcester, and often redlining was a part of that narrative. And what redlining is when you intentionally move people into lower income neighborhoods so you don't raise property values for white home buyers, right? So this is something that's existed for many years. The projects that I grew up in are called Plumley Village, and there's primarily Black, Hispanic, and Vietnamese kids. And something that I always found was interesting was the narrative that was delivered onto us was that we won for very good reasons, didn't trust the police because of the idea that a lot of us would be identified solely on the basis of race and arrested. When I was 14 years old, I was brought into the police department, questioned for a few hours because they were looking for a long-haired Hispanic male. The reason why I'm starting with this part of my story is because these things that happen systemically, these forms of oppression, these forms of things that happen to specific communities because of the systems that we live in and the society that we live in, shape the rest of our lives. I grew up in a house with a metal door that had bullet holes in it. What does that do for someone's emotional state of being? And when you see your community often turning to violence and harming each other because the system at play is working against us, right? I think something that's then important from there, fast forward, a few years, I end up institutionalized for 4.5 years of my life. The very instance of being perceived as violent. I mean, particularly Black, Brown, Indigenous people of color are 4 to 5 times more likely to be diagnosed with schizophrenia than white folk. That is true amongst federal studies. It's actually demonstrated through NIMH that that is indeed the number. It varies between 4 and 5, but that is the number. And there is a intense history of psychiatric violence towards Black and Brown Indigenous people of color. The American Psychiatric Association issued an apology about it last year. So this is no secret to us, right? And what does this do for unhoused people and houseless people, right? Well, most of the unhoused and houseless people are the people with mental health diagnoses that are deemed socially unacceptable, right? The folks that you can't handle, that are so visibly, moving against the convention of what is acceptable in our, world, in our space, right? Or maybe very visibly experiencing some type of emotional distress through a trauma that is manifesting, right? Or a variety of things. Sometimes it is just an unaddressed experience that could have been thought of otherwise, right? There's, for example, the experience of hearing voices, and that maybe sometimes just talking about those voices, talking about what you're going through as common experience in community with people who understand to a certain degree could be a benefit. So for me, 4.5 years being institutionalized, I didn't know of peer support as a resource. I didn't know of the movements that encompassed peer support in the mental health system, that encompassed things that we all very well know here as we gather and we talk about peer street outreach. So particularly for me, it was coming out of psychiatric institutions where I was like, I want to get away. I just want to get away from the mental health system in any context. I actually wasn't interested in working in peer support at first. I wanted to just pursue a career in the arts because I'm an artist, a multimedia artist. And I actually ended up being drawn into a peer-run organization, one of the recovery learning communities in Massachusetts. And the reason why I ended up coming to one of those spaces was because I was working with a case manager who said, hey, you're an artist. Maybe you want to do some art at this mental health program. Little did I know that it was so much more than that, right? Community space, what I would be connected to, how I would relate. But for me, the important thing here is that when society doesn't really seem to care whether if you live or die, which we've seen very clearly demonstrated by all those Hispanic children and brown children who were recently murdered in the school shooting in Texas, or the many instances we've seen these last few years, that is there in fact a mode for living in what the United States deems as success in this country, when we're already pre-categorized and set to fail in that way. And I think more largely when we talk about people, the mental health diagnoses and who experience emotional distress, that same predisposition is there. When we talk about disabled people, that same predisposition is there, right? And often our society fears people with mental health diagnoses because they fear themselves losing control. They fear their loved ones losing control. They fear someone entering that state of being in a way where they would be then institutionalized and put away. Often families push people away for a variety of reasons. Sometimes people are driven there because of situations of violence in their own life. So I think one thing that I'll encourage folks today is to just broaden your narrative around unhoused, houseless people, right? And the emotional distress that they experience. What led there and what it is like to live each day in that way. And also to understand that so many of the institutional spaces that we know, and I'm including shelters, I'm including group homes, I'm including other facilities. The care work, the supposed care work that's being done is often being done without consideration of any of those folks. Often that work and how it is created, designed, and done is not led by the people who are impacted by that experience. So I think leadership of those who are most impacted is so important. Something that really stuck with me as an experience was when I was living without a home, there was a time where I had actually laid on a bench during a very cold winter day, and that there was actually enough snow that covered my body as I was laying down that someone sat down nearly on top of me, waiting for the bus. And, you know, I look back at that experience as more, there isn't spaces that exist that aren't hostile architecture, which is what people often call it, like comfortable spaces where people can just be unhoused outside. If shelters aren't going to be safe, at the very least, having those spaces be open. I mean, we have enough houses in this country, enough houses in many different spaces that are vacant. The solution to a lot of these things is, in fact, giving people housing. It's just simply people don't want to drive their property costs down. Private companies don't want to go that direction. So we really have to shift the narrative when we're thinking about private companies, particularly realtors who are worried about property costs. And instead, how can we just reinvest that property and live in community together? Thinking more intentionally about that. I do want to say a little bit about the organization that I work for, which is the Kiva Centers. I'm the chief operating officer there. It's the very same community that had the recovery learning community that welcomed me years ago. And we opened a peer respite in 2020, right at the height of the pandemic. We've supported 568 people since that respite has opened. And what's particularly great about Coercion Peer Respite is that it is a mobile peer respite as well as an on-site, if you will. So has a house, right? Has a mobile component. We travel around the state of Massachusetts and support people for up to 4 hours at a time when they're in crisis. And more often than not, those folks are people living without a home, people who are unhoused in the community. And something that often leads to those circumstances is that there's so much right now that have either led to someone being evicted from their home or being asked to leave their family home or not being able to return. I mean, domestic violence went up 45% since the beginning of the pandemic. Think about that. 45% of people were in violent circumstances where they couldn't stay in the home that they were in. And the fact that there is a drive to institutionalize so many unhoused people, there's so much coercion out there that we see, particularly throughout the pandemic. We have also supported 200 people in an area called Mass and Cass, which is short for Massachusetts Avenue and Cassidy Boulevard in Boston. And it's also referred to in a very terrible way as methadone mile, because most of the folks there are actively using. We go there and we actually work with folks on housing vouchers, things that they need, things that people need in general that they don't often think of, right? I mean, people think of bringing folks food, blankets, things like that, but not a tablet or like a computer to actually sit down and fill out some of these forms and to work together and to talk about some of these things. In addition to, right, having a lot of those materials such as food and sleeping bags. Anyway, all of these people in tents were served eviction notices on their tents. The city of Boston had actually written up eviction notices and taped it to all 150 to 200 of these tents and told people that they had to leave. Madison Cass within itself being such a beautiful community where people are supporting each other and coexisting, and yes, actively using and struggling. But I think we also have to come to terms with our society can't exist in a way where we're always happy, where that's the standard, where we're always living well, where we're always, continuously carrying ourselves in a positive manner, because there's so much that happens in our lives. So what I want to invite people to think about is that instead of a self-care approach that we often turn to in mental health and emotional distress, particularly when someone's unhoused, thinking of a community approach, a community care approach, where we're working together. We have mutual aid networks, right? Where we know friends of friends who might have rooms available, or places that will bring people in who are unhoused, as well as places like peer respites are other resources, as well as mobile responses, as well as mobile warm stations, vans that just go around with people and meet them there, as well as crisis responses that are led by unhoused people, right? The beauty of that really is it rings so true to this message that that I would often hear when exploring a lot of the history of the peer support movement, the psychiatric survivor movement, and that's housing, not Haldol, right? Why do we so readily turn to medicating someone, doing something against their will, before we actually turn to the tangible solutions that are present and there? In the long run, it's more sustainable to house unhoused people. In the long term, it's just so it's so important. I think another point that I really do want to just as well say is this: you see a lot of people in public places, such as subways, such as other enclosed areas, bridges, and it's important to meet people there and also understand that as violent situations arise, to not further criminalize people with mental health diagnoses. We don't understand the circumstances that actually lead to someone harming someone else. And that by actually having community-driven approaches that are more sustainable, like the ones we're all talking about, you could drive violence down collectively in our society significantly. You could address some of these issues around systemic racism and systemic oppression. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Vesper. And I want to, I love this idea about mobile warm stations. I've been talking about this in New York City. I know that Long Island, I think Harvey, Hallie used to have a van that they would feed the homeless, and they may still have it across Long Island. But we really need one in New York City. It would be, so maybe you can advocate for that, Harvey.
The van that Hallie had was a mobile shower.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Shower, all kinds of things like that, that I've been looking, and I don't think we have that in New York City readily.
Let's work on that. Let's work on that.
Yep, let's work on it.
You got it.
So our next, thank you, Vesper. Our next speaker is Gerald Jenkins. I'm so happy that he's here and he's able to speak. He's Assistant Program Director of the Brooklyn Crisis Residential Services, located in the heart of Brooklyn, New York. Mr. Jenkins has over 30 years of experience in the behavioral health and substance addiction field. And you can say more about yourself. So Gerald, take it away.
Thank you, Cecilia, and thank everyone for the comments. With me, I want to talk about, my experiences, I was homeless by my own demise, and the reason why I say that is that, it was through addiction, right? So I tell you a little bit about me. I was born with one kidney. I had a hole in the heart. I was diagnosed with ADHD. And I can remember as a kid, my mother advocating for me, to, tell the doctors like, hey, no, I don't want my son on medication, right? Because it doesn't allow him to be, a child, or play as a kid, and I was also limited to other things, right? Because again, I had one kidney. And by the way, I had an open colostomy as a toddler up until about 6 years old. So, and then I had a hole in my heart. So it was like, I couldn't really get involved with any physical contact sports, and which I had loved to do. And so it was that my mother was able to support me by providing me with some DJ equipment, right? Because she knew I had the love of music, right? And that started me with, kind of like DJing. It became a hobby, and it was also a coping skill for me, right? To support me, to help me minimize my ADHD, right? And as I got older, I got involved with substance use, which brought me to me being homeless. And it's like, with me being, coming to that point in my life, was very traumatized. I was very traumatized, and I slept on the trains, I slept in the parks bench, and it was until I came to a place where, and by the way, it was, substance use involved too, but, I was able to come to a place that was able to provide me some supports, right? And I remember the outreach team coming out to Grand Central Station and offering me to go to the shelter. And when I went to the shelter, I was like, but then when I seen the activities that was going on in the shelter, that even, traumatized me, and, I was like, well, no, I didn't really want to be a part of it. So I kind of felt comfortable with, sleeping on the streets, until, I came to a point to where I wanted to change my life, right? I wanted to stop using substances, and I just wanted my life to be better than what it was. And, I came into this place where they were able to support me. I went there in my own will, and they provided me with support. And it's actually the agency that I work for, which is Services for the Underserved. And there wasn't no coercion there. It was more supportive, right? It was, hey, how can we help you? They had allowed me to be, kind of like in the driver's seat of my own recovery, with the supports of, guiding me through. And I'm forever grateful for them. Because I think if I wouldn't have had to take that route, I probably would, I don't know where I would be, right? But I know today that I'm in the right place. Also, like, so I do work for the agency. I've been working for them now for about 28 years. And, you know, and they have provided me supports all the way. So I was able to be able to, because one of the things that I wanted to do is that I wanted to give back, right? And they had allowed me to do that by employing me, and to be able to share my lived experience with others, and also share, you know, my coping skills. And so I remember starting out as I was a peer in 1994. I started out as a peer with Services from the in 1994, and to this day, I am currently now the assistant program director of the crisis residential respite, right? And at this respite, we serve a lot of individuals, such as myself, with resources and finding housing, being able to deal with crisis, trauma, and we come from a place of lived experience. So there's no coercion. It's that, you know, the individual that's there, we allow them to drive, you know, their recovery with our support, and help them along with reaching their goals. Yes, we have helped a lot of individuals who are homeless. We have supported a lot of individuals, you know, who comes from a shelter environment, that just, you know, kind of like needs a break from that environment, or a break from their living situation, or a break from their emotional crisis that they are dealing with, whether it's homelessness, substance use, domestic violence, and we provide them the support that they need. And all of the staff at the crisis respites are peers, right? And we all share our lived experience to support each other, to support the individuals in who we're serving. I remember bringing this idea to the director of mental health in the agency, and because I was aware of Rose House, and I really loved what they were doing at their respite, and I was like, you know, so I brought it to them, and I brought it to the director of mental health, and I was like, hey, let's, you know, get a respite, and, you know, and we can use, you know, I was really planning it for them. I was like, well, we can use, you know, we can use some of the staff offices, you know, they can work out in the field. We can use the offices as the respite, and, you know, but they kind of like helped me kind of like shape and said, well, you know, when the time come, and our respite program has been in existence since 2013. And we are also connected with, you know, Wellness Works, the New York City New York City Well. So, you know, and who we use, you know, as a warm line in New York City, you know, and, you know, I just love, you know, what we're doing, but we need to do more, right? We need to do more, and we need to be able to support individuals. And let me tell you, right, we don't, at our respite, when an individual is having an emotional crisis, we do not call the police, right? All the staff has been trained in what we call IPS, intentional peer support, right? And what we and how we deliver that is awesome, you know, because it allows us to be able to make the connection with the individual, as well as allowing that individual to share their worldview, right? And also having mutuality, you know, being able to say to the individual, you know, what we see, what we feel, and what we hear, and vice versa, you know, and we make it where we're moving towards supporting the individual without going to the hospital. As a matter of fact, our respites are a hospital diversion, an ER diversion, you know, because a lot of times, you know, a lot of times people just don't need to be in the hospital,
Yeah,
you know, you
yeah.
know.
I wish we can listen to you, Gerald. This is the first time I really heard your story.
Oh,
I
I'm
just
sorry.
because Tony is our next speaker, and
Okay,
but we'll talk after this. I'm sorry.
okay.
But
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much. So last but not least is Tony Monez, right? Am I right?
Mhm.
So Tony is a New York's certified peer specialist and certified national peer specialist, which means he lives with the mental health condition and uses his experience to support and meet with peers. Currently, he's a student at SUNY Empire State College, where he's pursuing his bachelor's degree in psychology. So you can say more, but it's a wonderful bio. Tony, take it away.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Celia and Peter, for inviting me. And, you know, I think the one good thing about going last is that, you know, I can relate. And I think this is exactly what peer support is, right? Because we have that lived experience and we can share, you know, our hopes, our visions of what we want to have, how we want to live our lives. So I thank everybody for sharing your stories. So I'll start off with growing up. You know, I grew up in having living in a with housing instability, not knowing, you know, back then what it was, how it impacted me moving forward in my life. You know, I ended up becoming homeless later in life in 2012 after 15 years of recovery from substance use. I ended up losing my job in hotel industry, which just spiraled out of control, right? The good thing is that I had recovery behind me, so I was able to hold on to that. But coming into the shelter system was, I think, a shock to me, right? Because I find myself at the most vulnerable time in my life, and going into into the system where they don't see me, they see a number, and they see somebody that is, you know, too lazy to work, or, you know, not wanting to take care of themselves. Nobody bothered to get to the untold story that I brought, right? Because they only saw somebody that was probably trying to abuse the system. So I hit the shelter system. I was provided with a shelter place to go. I walked in. The first thing was I was looked as someone less than by the front people at the shelter. The living conditions were terrible. The drug and substance use was rampant. And I just couldn't stay there. So I elected not to go into the shelter system. And I, decided that I would, do my best to stay in the streets or wherever I could find shelter. Luckily for me, I didn't have to stay out very long because I was able to find work shortly after that. And I came into, this is where I have my experience, and this is where peer support comes in to play for me. I ended up working or getting hired with Parachute, which is where I met Peter. So working at the respite and then working for the mobile part of Parachute, which was to do engagement in the community where people were living. And I think, the one thing that I learned about peer support and, is holding these safe spaces for people, right? Because somebody was able to do that for me to give me this safe space to be able to tell my story and be able to recover and be able to move forward. And I think the great thing about, some of the programs that we come into that are able to hold people in these spaces and provide a humane way of engaging and working with individuals, where nothing is forced on anybody. We can all come and find our own solutions and our own way of moving forward in our recoveries. I am currently working on a mobile crisis unit here in New York. And our work sometimes takes us into the shelter system. And, I think my own experience is, is what I experienced when I go into these shelters, right? There's no trauma-informed care being practiced in these shelters. The pushback we get from staff sometimes when we're trying to locate somebody and be able to support them, be able to get them the care that they need is still there. One of the things that when I became homeless is the questions that I would ask, right? How do I become homeless? When you could have paid my rent, which was less than the money that you're paying to put me in a shelter, it makes no sense. And some of the policies that these systems and these policymakers make no sense whatsoever. They're illogical to me. I really believe that peers need to be embedded in every system that touches a person. We have youth advocates, we have youth peers, family peers, forensic peers. These are the people that know the best and can be able to support and hold these spaces for the individuals. There's a lot of work to be done. And I'm just I can go on and on, but I think we've all shared our experiences, and this is what we come up to in the systems and in what we're what the government fails or the city or the state fails to see by bringing peers, we can help them to make better policies. We can help them to, advocate for better places to find, right? Instead of removing all these encampments, there's other ways of doing humane things and allowing people to recover in a way that they want to, right? It's not always what we want them to be, it's what they want out of their lives.
Oh, Tony, thank you so much. I mean, I think we needed more time. This panel is just excellent, and I'm learning so much. I think what
We can go a little longer, Celia, if you need to.
is everybody, the panelists okay with that? Laura, no?
Even if, I love Laura, but even if she can't stay and others can.
Oh, is that,
Make-
okay, I'm sorry, I didn't catch that dialogue.
I was just saying, if some folks want to stick around and talk a little bit, we can do that.
Oh, okay. I actually just have something that I have a commitment that thank you.
You're welcome, Laura.
And Peter, can you stay a little longer, or?
Yeah, sure.
And Gerald, Evelyn, Vesper? Am I
Can I
missing?
just get a sense of what longer means? That's what I was trying to find
Another
out.
15 minutes probably.
Oh, of course.
Oh,
That's what I
okay.
scheduled.
Okay,
Thank you. Thanks a
so,
lot.
Do we want to take questions from the participants, or is there anything that was in the chat that we want to respond to?
yeah.
I mean, I want to say one little thing, if I may.
Go ahead.
When we're talking, several of us have been talking about 1993, 94, and when we're thinking back then, we made news, and now it's 2022, and it's still news, to most people. I find that very hard to understand. I find that really, really mind-blowing, because what does that mean? Does that mean that it's bad news, or does that mean is nobody wants to hear the good news? I feel it's the latter. I feel there's a massive resistance from the system that actually wants to hear this stuff. And maybe another time we can talk more about that, but that's just what I'm feeling. No matter how hard we try, no matter how many people come out of the shelter system, like Gerald, and then take over running a program, it's not going to be a mainstream thing because the system is too afraid of us. That's what I'm just going to put out.
Thanks, Peter. Daniela. No, let's do questions. Daniela, do you want to go in the chat and see any questions or comments for the panel?
Yeah, so there was actually a question that sparked some chat from some of the panelists, but in case people didn't see it, I'd like to just say this one out loud again. So someone chatted, and I'm curious about the effect of the professionalization of peer support on the future of peer work, especially as it relates to building community power and foundations of community care. And they'd love for folks to speak on that. I know Laura and Vesper, you guys were pretty active in the chat box. Maybe we could just give a little brief summary of what you had put in the chat.
Well, just briefly, I think it goes directly to what Peter was asking. To be honest with you, I guess the main question I have now that I hear you ask the question out loud is, why did we go professional? Why did we do that? Because we're in the mixture. Somebody I know is baking a cake and accidentally put the flour in before they were supposed to. Well, it turned out it was too late. They still had to bake the cake. They couldn't take the flour out of the mixture. So, I really find Peter's point appealing and interesting and crucial. I also find the chat that we had with Vesper, and I believe his name is Jason, it's beginning to pull those things out. So Vesper, did you want to?
Yeah, thank you. I have there's a lot to add here. I'm gonna try to be brief about it. So 70s, you have like deinstitutionalization, right? There's a lot that was happening, politically. And I think something that is interesting is when you think of the war on drugs, how that was honestly like a war on race, a war on the radicals, a war on a lot of folks. And there was a need to sustain movements financially, right? And I think peer support was a part of that, as well as peer support was always a movement tool, right? It's always existed as something that we do. It's also just a beautiful thing that we do in community with our families, with each other. Like just it's a naturally occurring thing. It's something that's existed in indigenous societies for like hundreds and thousands of years. But one of the things that we face with the professionalization of peer support, we're in a very unique position as like survivors, people with lived experience of like that professionalization looks different, right? In a lot of contexts, right? And it's not like when there was necessarily a professionalization of social work, because you had a lot of these professionals who could continue community organizing, not as active working social workers, right? But now you have survivors, people with lived experience who might be at threat of losing their job if they advocate or if they speak out, at threat of many different things that might happen. So you have like 30 years here, right, from the 90s to now. And then you also have the establishment of peer support. Like we're going to establish our own alternatives. We're going to build upon it, right? So eventually they're not alternatives anymore, right? They're in the mainstream, they're there. But as we get into the mainstream, as I said in the chat, there will be positives and negatives, right? Using peer supporters as tools for coercion, but having more access to our people who are oppressed in different systems and different spaces, right? Having peer-run respites and peer-run spaces, because we've proved the efficacy and the efficiency, right, of this on a systemic level, right? But then at the same time, a minimizing of our code of ethics and maybe utilizing us in different roles that we shouldn't be utilized in, or bringing people on who don't have lived experience. So there's a need to advocate a way to formalize, and definitely making sure advocacy is at the center of your peer support work, you know?
Hey, Vesper, is there a way, you're doing such a good job at the Kiva centers, is there a plan you have or you advise to expand those using the funding streams that are out there and yet being faithful to it? Do you have thoughts about that?
Yeah. I think you can. There's been this discussion about systems funding. Like, can you accept systems funding and maintain the work? I believe you can, but you cannot solely rely on systems funding. It's important to get foundation funding, crowdfunding, other sources so you can remain autonomous to a certain extent. That'll happen. But also, if you diversify with different types of systems funding, you can also, you know, speak out and do certain things. I think we're always riding a very difficult line, right? Like I know that there have been SAMHSA grants in the past that I've applied for where they clearly say like, will you be community organizing? And you have to fill out this specific form. And if you do community organizing, you can't do it through those grant funds, right? So I try to be very specific about my time, how my time's utilized, when I speak out in what spaces. I think that's important. I think also having coalitions and groups that can exist independently of systems funding, like crowdfunding, different sources, that can be important, especially as you see more and more coercive things happening, right? We're having so much happen with mental health and substance use right now that there's going to be more coercive things coming along the way. So I highly recommend thinking of creative ways to organize and sustain the wonderful work that we do.
Thanks, Vesper. I just want,
I
can
actually-
people, I'm sorry, Laura, I just want to make a short announcement. We'd like to show the Howie C. Harp clip
In 10 minutes, not
in
right
10
now.
minutes.
No, not.
We have time. We have time.
Yeah,
We
for
have
we'll-
time, okay.
Yeah, I just want to dovetail on what Vesper's saying, which is really a dovetail, and that is that we need to look at, in terms of the systems funding, the disability rights movement is a whole other movement that we haven't really talked a lot about. And they're very involved, and because we are people with disabilities as well, and don't kind of forget that we're under the ADA as well, people with psychiatric disabilities. But home and community-based services is a funding stream that really, you know, is so in line with our values in terms of bringing in housing and bringing in support services that are determined by the person with disabilities. So I think that part of what we're talking about here is, yes, philanthropy, definitely. The Promise Resource Network in North Carolina does a really good job, as Vesper would know, of kind of coupling services with systems dollars with philanthropy and creatively creating ways. But I think what comes back is how do peer supporters, how do peer support specialists who are currently on the ground helping homeless people, how do they navigate the system so that some of these programs and services coming down through the federal government can actually start in other words, it helped me to know when I was working with Project Oats that I had funding that I could call on to provide a meal to a homeless person on the streets, that I could pay for that meal. And now we really don't know. There's so many things that get drawn back, that get kind of titrated or tapered. So I think that for peer supporters now and peer specialists, really being aware of how your particular job is funded. If you have petty cash, remember petty cash.
Workaround money.
If you're able to use resources like that. Also want to remind people that the White House, and I guess I'll just say this, has a call almost every week for people with disabilities where they make announcements of current things happen in the administration, and they're public calls. I'll get the address to Daniela so she can send it out. But they're now talking about unwinding Medicaid. And what that means is Medicaid has been kind of caught up in these rules, and they're speaking about unwinding them so that there's more flexibility. And that's really crucial because so many people on SSI, not DI, but I, have access to Medicaid dollars. So once you get someone a place to live and they have, or you don't even get, you can have SSI, you can have SSI and be on the streets, actually, if you have an address. So once you get SSI, you have all these other services, ideally, that can actually help bring in new resources for people who are currently homeless.
I'm getting a lot, I'm just getting a lot of comments. People want to see more of this panel. So I'd say a couple of things. One of them is maybe we can do a part 2. We can keep
Yes,
going.
I was just saying
Yeah.
that to
But the other
Peter.
thing is, I would love to bring you all to our conference, which is September 21 to 23. We're going to try to also raise some scholarship funds so that some of you, this is a very special one. We haven't been because of COVID. So, please be on the lookout for more news about the conference. Also, as I'm doing the advertising here today, notice that there was an article in the Times around alternatives to medication and soteria houses. You'll see on the chat box, there'll be a webinar that Peter and others are hosting on June 9th. So that's free, and please sign up for that as well.
And I just thank you, Laura and Vesper. Thank you, Harvey.
And everyone.
And everyone. Evelyn, do you have any comments that you want to bring to the conversation? I think you're muted. Okay, I think.
There you go.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, talking
Mhm.
about the solutions to homelessness, and I was saying that we needed crisis respites, in-home services, and provide recovery-oriented support. A lot of times you walk by a homeless person and people don't even take into consideration on how they got there, or they just ignore them like they don't exist. And I think that we should try to stop doing that, and also please get them apartments so they can have a place to live. You know what I mean? As far as coercion, I was going to say, for those who don't know what it means, coercion means the action or practice of persuading someone to do something by force, and it takes place in hospitals, community-based mental health services, family homes, disability residential facilities, the streets, and subways. And I was saying that we can have peers, mental health crisis responses in the hospital emergency rooms, police precincts, jails, and on the wards to assist patients who are newly diagnosed with discharge plans to follow up. And we spoke a lot about the ACT team and the mobile crisis team, which I feel, that they're really working and they're helping a lot of people. Meeting people supports needs as well as being valuable in and of itself is also likely to reduce coercive intervention. Mayor Adams and Governor Hochul have the Safe Option support teams of 8 to 9 people to help the homeless in the subway. 8 to 9 people for one person is very scary, and I wouldn't feel safe. But let's see what happens. It would be interesting to see if there was any coercion involved when the homeless is asked to leave the subway and go into the new shelters that are supposed to be available. We need apartments for the homeless, not shelters. Being homeless was a challenge for me, but with prayer and support of the shelter staff, some of the residents, my family and friends I met along the way, I was able to succeed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evelyn. Peter?
Well, I wanted to go back to something that Vesper said, and also other people said about what is the nature of this peer support when you're outreaching to people in the street. And Vesper called it mobile respite. It's a beautiful idea. And you also mentioned the idea you take a tablet or a laptop and you sit down on the floor and you start working together, and you start, providing showers and maybe with a van. But even the idea of sitting with a laptop and a tablet and starting to work together, because I was trying to help this homeless man in the street here near my house for like 3 years, and nobody would come out and sit with him. Nobody would come out. Why? Because he probably smelled, and nobody would sit with him. And so to me, this is like the way to work. This is the way to work. You all who've been there can show the system what to do. If you're a professional and you're going out there, you don't know exactly what to do. I mean, of course, there's exceptions and people have been doing this for a long time, but you have answers that professionals do not have.
Can I give a good example of how that actually really literally happened? And this goes to Share Your Bounty and the Oakland Independent Support Center that Howie the Harp founded. There were 12 or 13 other peer-run programs that I did a research project and took a look at after the fact. Unfortunately, it was after they were finished and not during. But the findings, which included Share Your Bounty, concluded what incredible work was accomplished, to the point where at that point SAMHSA ended up funding 20 at the federal level, 20 brand new peer-run programs around the country. And peer-run research was done of that complement of programs. So at the national level, our services actually made a huge difference. And it was called the Consumer Operated Services Program, COSP. And there were peers that were professionally trained researchers that actually did the research on those programs. So I just want people to know that we have not gone unnoticed. I think what we can do, and maybe this will be like for phase 2, Harvey, or something, is that what do we need to do to kind of push ourselves forward? Because nobody else, what Peter's getting at, really, nobody else is going to push it for us. We need to push it ourselves. Yeah. So really, we've got the strength, we've got some data. Vesper pointed out some incredibly great data that we can start using. We've got services, we've got examples. We're living, breathing examples that peer support works. Look at us.
Look at us. Oh, I know.
Can I just say that,
Yes.
I think we need to look at, as a nation, what programs are working in different areas, right? And look at what can be brought into here in New York or in some other state that can offer a good alternative to providing individuals, however you want to call it, homeless, unsheltered, houseless. It all depends on the person and how they see themselves in this. But the numbers aren't going in the right direction, right? And it's estimated that by 2030, the retiring age individuals will be the highest homeless population.
Yeah. Thank you, Tony. Gerald, did you have any comments? Did you want to?
No.
Okay. I just want to make sure everybody has a voice. So sorry.
Thank you.
Maybe we should show the video because how it brings it to life, you know. And Howie, those of you who've known Howie, it was a beacon, you know. He was a beacon out there, and he was also very political. I mean,
Who's got the video? Whose computer?
Daniela has it. She's gonna do it.
I can
sent
share
it.
that right now.
Thank you.
Okay,
Danielle.
thank you.
I was called Howie the Harp because when I was on the streets, one of the ways that I made money was by playing the harmonica. I was a street musician. And people started calling me Howie the Harp, and it kind of stuck. So that's my name. I kind of like the name because it gives me the same middle name as a lot of famous people in history, like Ivan the Terrible, Richard the Lionhearted, and Winnie the Pooh. This is the tools of my trade. The tool of my trade. Cookie time. Most homeless people are fiercely independent. Patrick Henry said, "Give me liberty or give me death." But the vast majority of people who have psychiatric histories are homeless because they were incarcerated in a mental hospital, and before they had a home. And during that time, if you're getting SSI, you lose your SSI once you're in an institution for more than a calendar month. Since you lost the SSI and you have no other income, you have no way of paying the rent. So wherever it is you're living is lost. And then when you finally are ready to go out of the hospital, you have really nowhere to go other than the board and care homes that they send most people to. And most of the homeless population are people that don't live well in board and care homes. And most of the people that come to this program won't go to any other program. This is the only one that they'll go to because this is the only one that they trust. Because it's run by people like them. Very often it's people working here are people that they knew out when they were out on the streets.
Mama, mama.
Thank you. It's a longer video, and I encourage you to look at it, more of it, when you can. But I love seeing him. I miss him, you know.
I always say how he lives.
How he
How he
lives.
lives. He lives in each of us every day, every single day.
Yeah.
maybe we could invite the mayor to our next webinar.
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I don't know how to do it. Maybe Harvey, does somebody know the mayor to invite him? I don't know.
Let me tell you, the mayor could be here. He needs to be here for hours based on how he's the approach he's taking right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's been a rough year for coercion, and he hasn't honestly been helped in that.
He alone can fix this.
Well, should we wrap it up, Celia? What do you think?
Sure.
People
I
want
think-
another. Next time we'll maybe spread it even more widely, because I know we had a great group today, and we could do something else. We'll think about it. What do people think about doing a part 2?
I think this group, or, you know, if we want other people, I think it would be good the next time to do a part 2 and maybe talk about all these different alternatives and strategies that we did talk about, but really kind of focus on it maybe. What do you think?
Well, let's think about it. Gerald wants to say something.
Okay, go ahead, Gerald.
No, I'm disagreeing with y'all. Thumbs up.
And
Okay.
you know, Gerald, maybe a little modest, but Gerald is our DJ in another group that I'm involved with called Healing in Hip Hop. So he's a DJ. And we have been presenting at NYASPIS for a couple of years, right, Harvey? So
Conference begins with Gerald and it peaks with Gerald at the barbecue. So don't miss Gerald at the conference.
Oh,
right. So just want to mention that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, all the panelists. I'm just so touched, and I really have to debrief after this because hearing all your stories and strategies, I just love us. I just think that we're so great, and other people need to see how great and awesome we are. I just love our movement. And I love peer support. Again, it's really kind of safe.
And I want to take a minute
That.
to extend our love to you, Celia, because for all that
Oh.
you've done over the years and even throughout this, your spirit, you're organizing this, you're a mother of the movement, you know?
Oh my God. I never was called that. Thank you. I'm honored. I'm honored.
You bet.
Thank you. Peter, any last words? Okay. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Be on the lookout for more information. Join that NIAPRS e-news list and we'll be advertising it when that part 2 is going to be, and the conference and the Soteria workshop and Gerald's next performance. We'll get everything in.
Great. All right, everyone.
All right, everyone.